So we're welcoming David Godman once again as our guest in a self-investigation gathering. And as we most of us already know, David Godman has written, studied, and practiced Sri Ramana Maharshi's teachings for now, I think, closer to about 5 decades, and written also about some of Bhagavan's closest devotees during his lifetime, namely Lakshmana Swami, to mention, and Papaji. And now, David, nice to have you with us again. And we agreed that the topics maybe are about a little bit about background, as you know, about Nisargadatta Maharaj, and how his teaching methods maybe, and teachings in general, and if we can a little bit compare to Ramana Maharshi's teachings, are there similarities or main big differences, for example, between these two teachers? And of course, the other subject was about surrender, what prevents us from surrendering to God or ourselves, whatever we call it, and what's the role of free will in this process. Those are our main topics I think we can talk about, and of course everybody is free to ask questions, I guess, during the way. And also to mention here that I'm not translating this time to Finnish, so let's keep it better flow in this talk, and then later on subtitles will mystically be done, I hope. So please, David, you can begin if you want.
Does anybody have a question on this, or shall I just start talking?
No pre-question, or I don't know, does anybody have questions immediately? Maybe you can just talk about Nisargadatta Maharaj or your experiences and what comes in mind about, from your point of view, about him as a teacher, or whatever you feel like talking about.
Okay, let's start off with his teaching methods, because I came across Nisargadatta by reading I Am That, which is probably the gateway that most people came to him through. And that is a series of very expansive conversations and dialogues in which the main thrust of the teachings always seems to be to go back to the I Am, which I take to be the same focus that Bhagavan taught when he said, hold on to the I thought. Maharaj was always saying, immerse yourself in this sense of I am, this feeling of I am. That I am is consciousness. And if you immerse yourself in consciousness, become one with consciousness, then you are going back to your source. But unlike Ramana, he didn't seem to think that this thing that he called consciousness was the final state. He saw it as an intermediate state, and that this consciousness eventually resolved itself into what he called awareness. So in the Maharaj scheme of things, consciousness arises out of awareness. Consciousness is the totality of your being, its God, its manifestation. And the way back to this full awareness is through consciousness. You become one with the consciousness that is everything. And having done that, it then withdraws or resolves itself into its source, which is awareness. As for teaching methods, as I said, in I Am That, it seemed to be very practice oriented, in that he was telling you to do this as a practice, saying, go off, be the I am, be aware of the I am, immerse yourself fully in the state of I amness, and that will reveal to you your true nature. It will reveal to you your I amness, and then that I amness will go back to its source. But by the time that I went to see him, which was the late 1970s, he wasn't so discursive. He wasn't recommending this so much. And he was willing to listen to you for a little bit. He would humor you when you first came. When you went in, he would pick you out, make you sit in front of him and ask you who you were, where you were from, what practices you were doing, who was your teacher, what methods you were following. He would make you give a presentation, if you like, of what your worldview was, what your practices were, what you hoped to get out of them. And then very slowly, very systematically, he would undermine your worldview, your practices, and make you realize and understand that whatever practices you were doing were inherently conceptual, if you like. He spoke in Marathi, and I think the only word that most of us foreigners ever learned in Marathi was kalpana, which means concept. And after a while, whatever question you asked, he'd just bang his fist on the floor and shout kalpana at you, and that would be the end of the question. He wouldn't give it an answer. So he when you first came, he would let you talk a little bit, but his first admonition, his first restriction on what you could talk about, he would say, I'm not interested in what you've heard, I'm not interested in what you've read. Here we only talk about your own experience of yourself. Don't bring in anything that's not a direct experience that you've had yourself. Everything else is only an opinion. So that would narrow the range of possible questions in conversations down a little bit. And then you could talk about that. And then once you'd had those initial dialogues, then he would bring out the real killer restriction. And he said, I'm not interested in answering hypothetical questions. I'm not interested in ideas that you have about yourself, which are not true. So if you come up to me and say, how do I get enlightened? Then you're presupposing there's an I inside yourself that needs to do something to get enlightened. For me, that's a hypothetical question. It's a wrong perspective. And I'm not going to waste my time dealing with questions that are based on the premise of there's a real person in there who needs to do something to reach some state which they're not in right now. So when you think about this particular restriction, it effectively cuts down every possible question that you can ask to a teacher. You can't say, how does karma work? You can't say, how does reincarnation work? You can't say, how do I get enlightened? Because everything you might ask somehow presupposes a person who needs to understand something or needs to gain something. And he said, that's just a hypothetical abstraction. I don't accept that hypothetical abstraction, so I'm not going to answer it. So then, having silenced everybody in front of him, with no one being able to ask any sensible question which met his criteria of not being anything you'd heard or read and not being hypothetical, then he would talk about the nature of consciousness, what it was, how it arose, how it manifested, how you had to become one with it and go back to its source. And in the last year or two of his life, this was just about the only thing he ever talked about. And it did get a little bit monotonous, not monotonous. It got very, you heard him say the same things again and again and again. You went there in the morning and you'd hear him say exactly the same thing he'd said the day before and the day before that. And inside you might be saying, come on, just vary the diet a little bit. This restaurant's only got one item on the menu. Like, that's what you served me yesterday and the day before, kind of, let's have some variety. But you couldn't interrupt, because any interruption he would take to be a presupposition that there was a person there asking a question who needed satisfaction or an answer. So you sat there and listened, and he would talk endlessly about the nature of consciousness. And then a moment would come in which you'd realize he wasn't giving you information. He wasn't giving you a description of something. he was actually giving you a very intimate commentary on what you were in that moment. So you found yourself switching from being an absorber of information about some concept, some idea, and you suddenly realize, no, this is my true nature, this is who I am. And you recognized that beingness that he was talking about. And there was a kind of internal non-verbal agreement with what he was saying, because you recognized in yourself that he was describing who you were as beingness in that moment. So that there was a kind of, haha, yes, this is who I am right now. And he called this getting the knowledge. Now, getting the knowledge wasn't liberation or enlightenment. It was just somehow cutting through all the extraneous, superfluous ideas, concepts you have about yourself, and somehow grounding yourself in a state of beingness, which you recognized as your own inner nature, and not being distracted or taken away from that sense of beingness by any ideas or thoughts about who you might be and what you might have to do to attain or accomplish something other than yourself. So this was what he was trying to do in his final years. And I think it was very, very similar to what the old Upanishadic rishis used to do when they would say, you are Brahman, you are consciousness. That's a shorthand version of telling you who you are. Nisargadatta had a more elaborate, long-winded way. His basic summary of what consciousness was, how it arose, it might take about 10 minutes. But the basic essence of everything he said is, you are this consciousness, this is who you are. Don't imagine or pretend that you're anything else other than this consciousness. And after a while, just listening to this day after day, you became that consciousness, you settled in that consciousness, and you sat there with a kind of nice sort of ear-to-ear grin on your face, because you'd finally got it. You'd recognized your own nature simply by the force of his words. He wasn't telling you to do something to attain this state of consciousness. He was simply endlessly saying, this is who you are, this is who you are, this is who you are. And finally, the penny would drop and you'd recognize this to be your own inner state. So I think this is what he was trying to do in the last 2 or 3 years of his life. He went beyond his earlier stages of having discussions, arguments, dialogues, and he would just sit there in a very forceful, feisty, shouty way, lecture us all on who we were and who we were not. And sooner or later, if you were willing to sit there and absorb the power that came off those words, you would recognize your own inner state, you would recognize that beingness that he was talking about. And this, I think, was also because he had the power to communicate this state. He wasn't just giving you information about the state, he was in that state himself. And so when he kept saying endlessly, you are consciousness, in all its various elaborations, there was a power inherent in those words, which somehow stuck inside you, and that power manifested as the state he was talking about. So he wasn't telling you to do something, he was simply telling you who you were, and there was a force and authority in his words that came from his own experience of that same state. And if you were quiet enough or receptive enough in those, not dialogues, in those monologues that he kept throwing at you, you'd recognize your own true nature and you'd just sit there silently abiding as it. So I think ultimately this was his final and most effective way of teachings. He'd simply tell you who you were endlessly. He wouldn't allow any interruptions or questions. And then finally, you'd get it and you'd sit there.
So if we compare this to Bhagavan's way, which was silence, basically, as far as I understand, which had no words basically at all, unless people started asking questions, of course, naturally, then he answered, but his main teaching was through silence, if you had this ability to receive it. Is it so?
This is true. I won't say there was a hierarchy, but that Bhagavan would say my highest principal teachings are silence. And he didn't mean by that simply an absence of dialogues. He said by abiding in that state of mauna, the state of silence, it created a kind of energy field around him. And if you were in that energy field, then you too could absorb or partake of that state of silence that Ramana was always in. So it wasn't that he was doing anything. He said, my job, or if you like, my duty is to abide as the self. And by abiding as that self, there is a kind, he called it the sanity, the presence, that's a Sanskrit term. He said there was an energy field which was created by that self-abidance, and that sanity would take care of all the needs, the desires of all the people who were thinking of him, practicing his teachings, sitting in his proximity. He said, I myself do nothing but abide in the self. But through that self-abidance, this sanity, this energy field is created, which grants the desires of all the people who come with desires. It gives the state of silence to the people who want to be quiet. And if they turn up in a mature enough state, it will even grant them liberation. It's nothing that I do. That's simply a byproduct of my self-abidance. So he said that this is the ultimate and highest teaching. I sit here abiding as the self. As a byproduct of that self-abidance, this sanity is created, and that sanity looks after all the spiritual needs and development of the people who come into its radius. He compared it to electricity that flows in a wire. He said that in its natural state, it flows unimpeded, but if you want to make it do some work, you plug in a fan, you make some resistance in the wire, and then a fan will revolve as a result of electricity going through some machinery. He said talking is a bit like interrupting the flow in the wire and making it do some work. He said it's not as effective as the pure silence, as the pure flow. But he said if people were not absorbing that silence, getting the experience from that silence, and wanted to talk to him, then he would come down a level. And his next level was to say, you are the self, you are Brahman, you are consciousness. And that's what Nisargadatta was doing almost every day in his final years. So Bhagavan wasn't telling people to do things. He was simply proclaiming, this is your nature, this is your identity, this is who you are. And in a few cases, those simple proclamations would have the desired effect, and people would actually get into that state simply through the force of being told who they were by Bhagavan. But again, people would then say, well, that's not my experience, what do I do? And then he would come down a notch, he would come down a level, and that's when he would start talking about self-inquiry or surrender. So he said, my highest teachings are ultimately silence. These are the most effective teachings I have. If you can't tune into them, then I will talk to you. And the first thing I will tell you is who you are. And who you are is not who you imagine yourself to be. As with Maharaj, there was a force in his words. Because he was the self, when he told people, you are the self, you are Brahman, you are consciousness, there was a direct force which occasionally shook people out of their self-imposed limitations and made them experience that self for themselves. In the vast majority of cases, it didn't work, and that's when he started talking about more practical things. He would concede that the majority of people weren't going to get to the state of mauna simply by absorbing it in his presence, and they weren't going to get it by being told you are Brahman, you are consciousness. So then he would say, if you still think that you're a person, if your sense of personal identity is too solidly established to disintegrate in my presence or through being told who you are, then you have to do some practice. And the practice he preeminently recommended as the quickest and most direct path was self-inquiry.
I just got impression from what I know about, and from what you now are saying about Bhagavan and Nisargadatta, that Bhagavan was completed in his spiritual nature. And Nisargadatta was something that was still developing or something like this. I mean, that he, in the very beginning, like you say, he was talking, for example, about concepts, and then he was talking only about, I mean, not talking about concepts, but had a different little bit approach to how to talk with people. I mean, that in the very end, like you say, he was only talking about consciousness. So I mean that something changed.
I think his methods might have changed over the years. If you look at Bhagavan, the earliest and most extensive body of teachings we have is Who Am I?, which was composed around 1901, 1902. And I don't think Bhagavan ever changed or deviated anything that he wrote when he was basically 20 years old when that document was first written down. He might have stressed different things to different people, but I think his teaching was fully formed at the age of 20. Nisargadatta came from a different tradition. He came from a lineage of householder gurus who historically had been commissioned by their lineage to pass on a mantra of their lineage. They were all householders who lived in their houses, and the guru would travel from household to household. There were no communal satsangs, and he would just check up on your progress. So this was a very different kind of tradition, the Navnath Sampradaya that he came from. And he quite openly admitted, he said, this is not the teaching of my guru, this is not the teaching of my lineage. I was authorized to teach by my guru, Siddharameshwar, but he didn't tell me how to teach or what to teach. I more or less worked this out for myself, what works and what doesn't work. And I think over time, he tried different things, different methods, different techniques. And by the early 1970s, when Maurice Friedman was talking to him, I think we have a substantial body of records that indicate he was stressing absorption in the inner sense of I am, which was very typical of what Bhagavan was teaching throughout his life. By the late 1970s, I think he got physically incapable of having long dialogues, long conversations. And when I was there, he would often say, I'm old, I'm sick, I don't have much energy anymore. I haven't got time for, he used to call it kindergarten lessons. He said, I haven't got time for kindergarten lessons. I haven't got time to have arguments with you about things that don't exist. So I'm going to tell you who you are, take it or leave it. And that was the final phase of his teaching. I think basically he ran out of prana, if you like. He just got old, sick, he had cancer. And to his final day, he was barking out, you are that, you are that, you are that, hoping that people would get it. Some did, some didn't. But he was never someone who told you to go away and do a particular practice. I think he hoped or wanted or expected you to get some glimpse of that state simply by the authoritative power with which he told you that is your state right now.
Yes, right. Any questions?
Actually, also interesting thing is, I always, when I was reading and translating your article about Nisargadatta, I always was curious about what is this short, brief description of Nisargadatta's teachings, 5 minutes, that this woman that had problems.
Right.
Yes, it was interesting. What is it? 5 minutes, just very brief, very short. Unfortunately, we don't have it.
We don't have it, and don't ask me to remember, it's 40 years ago. But I think everybody in that room was completely astonished, simply because she was a native Spanish speaker who didn't know any English. Mm-hmm. had sat there very frustrated for several days, not being able to understand because there wasn't a Spanish translator there. But she said that Ramana Maharshi had appeared in her dreams and given her some teachings, and Maharaj got quite interested and said, well, what did he tell you? And so she gave a 5-minute summary, which wasn't Ramana's teachings. I mean, at that point, I knew enough about Ramana's teachings to know that this wasn't his language, his style, but it was very, very much the vocabulary, the style that Maharaj was teaching in at that particular point in time. And what she said on the basis of these instructions she'd had in her dream was almost identical to what he was telling everybody who came to see him at that point in time. So I think somehow Ramana had sent her, she knew who Ramana was. So I think somehow the self took the form of Ramana, appeared in her dream and gave her this teaching. And that's what brought her to India. And eventually she came to Nisargadatta. But somehow the message that she had received in her dream was very, very deeply and distinctively what Maharaj was teaching, not what Bhagavan was teaching.
That is why she came to Nisargadatta, actually.
I'm guessing so. I'm guessing that was her destiny, and she needed to find out about him through somebody who was more known. I think Ramana Maharshi probably had I think she was from Venezuela. In those days, nobody had heard of Nisargadatta, but Ramana Maharshi was a little bit more famous. There were books about him, there were pictures. So when she first saw him, I think she connected with the picture, with the books, and internalized it and somehow got the message of Maharaj's teachings, and that brought her to India, and it brought her to me, and I ended up taking her to Mumbai, and she ended up getting the teachings directly from him.
Great. Any questions related to Nisargadatta or Bhagavan, Ramana Maharshi, or this topic in general? Anybody? Everybody.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say what worked for me recently. From what I gathered recently about Ramana's teachings is that don't pay attention to body and the senses of the body, but raise your attention or raise your awareness somewhere above this. Well, I just say what happened. So yesterday I was at night listening to Robert Adams also, and I was thinking about this, and somehow I completely discarded, didn't care about body or my future, what will happen, and it sort of takes to this nice place. I don't know what to call it. It seems like that's what Ramana and Nisargadatta say, to keep your head above this body thing.
There's always two aspects to what Bhagavan is saying when he's talking about self-inquiry. There's the aspect of discrimination, vairagya, of telling you to ignore phenomena, whether it's body, sensations, thoughts, perceptions, but that is not an end in itself. Simply by ignoring things, you don't find out the true nature of who you are. He says it's a two-part process. You withdraw attention from the things that your mind appears to be interested in, and you refocus it, you transfer your attention to what it is inside yourself that's having those thoughts, having those feelings, having those perceptions. So simply ignoring phenomena is not in itself enough. So when you ask yourself, who am I? It's not some magic formula that produces a result. It's an invitation to put attention on the I inside yourself and not to let it wander off and associate with objects and phenomena. So that there's two things going on when you try to practice Bhagavan's teachings. There's a giving up of interest and attachment to objects, but simultaneously you have to go back to the subject and keep attention on that subject. Otherwise, it's not going to resolve itself into its source. Simply rejecting phenomena, rejecting body sensations, mind ideas, isn't a long-term strategy for success. For the final destruction of the I, you have to hold on to this I, watch it go back to its source and disappear in its source.
Yeah, it did not stay this thing. So yeah, it feels like a rather escapism if you're just ignoring things. Okay, it's more active as you described. Thank you.
But Bhagavan was always very, what's the word? He would never buy in or approve of anyone's amazing experiences. He would never say, very good, that's great. If people came to him and said, I just had a vision of God, he wouldn't be excited. He said, do you see God right now? Or who had the vision? Anything that comes and goes is not real. Focus on what's real. Who had the vision? Be aware of the one who had the amazing experience. So whatever your amazing experience was, if you ever reported it to him, he would always say, there's an experiencer who had this. The experience is no longer there. Therefore, the experience is not the truth. It's not God. It has no reality because it came and left. Something had the experience left, but the experiencer remained. He said, put your attention on the experiencer and don't be distracted by the experiences it has, because these are transient and they will just distract you from the inherent true nature of the experiencer, which is where you ought to be putting your attention.
Thank you.
Any questions? If there's no questions around related to Nisargadatta, for example, then we can of course go to this other topic we have about surrender, and what is surrender, what prevents us surrendering, and what's the role of free will, if any, in this process. So that was the other topic we had for today. Of course, we can just go and ask, what is surrender and what prevents us?
Does anyone have any specific questions on this, or shall I just start off in a more general way?
We don't have any pre-questions about it. But just
I could say some few comments about this. That's from what I gather, that the only freedom actually there is to turn attention away from world phenomena, because everything else, like, there's no other freedom really. And to me, it seems that this is like active surrender. If you manage to turn away your attention, then you're like surrendering.
Let's start off that there's one wonderful quote, I think it's in Talks, where Bhagavan defines surrender as surrender is to give yourself up to the original source of your being. That source is within yourself. So that, to me, sounds almost identical to his description of how to do self-inquiry. So if you're following his path of surrender, it's not the traditional dualistic bhakti approach of offering something to anything which is external. It's recognizing what is the nature of individual identity, recognizing that this individual identity, this person you take yourself to be, is not real, and resolving that notion of individuality back in its source, back in the self, and making it disappear. So in my view, surrender and inquiry are inherently the same thing, except that most people appear to approach surrender in a more devotional, dualistic way. They want to surrender their thoughts, their feelings, their problems to some kind of idea of the divine or some form of the self, and through that slowly diminish their sense of being an individual self. But this is a long established way of doing things in India. This is generally what surrender means in India. Bhagavan accepted this particular approach, but ultimately he said true surrender is not giving up properties of the individual I or problems of the individual I. It's actually giving up the I itself. And the only way he said you can successfully do this is to take it back to its source and make it dissolve in that source. So for him, surrender and inquiry are identical. The people who couldn't do self-inquiry often came or weren't interested or got bored with it or felt that temperamentally they weren't suited to it, would come to Bhagavan and say, I want to follow the surrender path, I want to follow the bhakti path. And he would say, fine, if that's the way you feel, then go ahead. But he always said that self-inquiry was the quickest, the most direct way to get enlightened. He would concede that surrender done unconditional surrender done properly would also result in the same state. But he said it was a harder path to follow. I think it's something that people think they can adopt as a plausible plan B when they get bored of doing self-inquiry. But it's a very easy path to get lost in. It's a path you can have blissful, happy, devotional states and think you're making a lot of progress, but there's still a blissful, happy I who's enjoying all these states and who hasn't really solved the problem of his own separation from the self.
David, could you please tell a little bit to clarify? As I understand, I mean that surrender is giving ourselves completely to God, but at the same time, somehow now I thought I know it very well, but somehow now I lost it. I mean that anyway, whether we surrender, I mean, when we surrender, we have to anyway be in the source. I mean that, or it is. I just somehow forgot how it can be the same thing. I mean that when you do self-inquiry, you constantly are concentrated on this on our source. But when you just surrender, it somehow the main thing is missing, then being concentrated in this in the source. Or how? Remind me, please, because somehow I forgot.
I think most people approach the path of surrender in the sense of having an idea of the divinity, whether it's the formless self or God, and offering, shall we say, the fruits of their actions or offering their thoughts to God, or trying to entrust all their decisions or day-to-day activities, saying, not my will, your will, you do what you want with me. I think these are steps in the right direction, but just as Bhagavan said, you don't get liberation by making intellectual statements such as I am that, I am Brahman. You don't get realization through the path of surrender by saying, Lord, do what you want with me, everything I have is yours. These are the intellectual equivalents of chanting I am Brahman, I am consciousness. They're very nice ideas, but they don't tackle the fundamental source, the idea of who you are, this person occupying a space inside a body. It's very nice to have these devotional feelings, these states, but they don't often take you back to the source. They take you off in directions that can be very blissful, very visionary, very happy states. You can get stuck in them for a long time, but there's always somebody who has the devotion to something else. There's always somebody who's surrendering to something else. You're setting up a realm in which your desire to surrender is somehow being manifested, in which your desires are fructifying in a new I won't say imaginary relationship, but you're using the I to get a measure of self-satisfaction. Whereas you should be looking at the I and making it disappear, not making it look for new blissful or exciting experiences to undergo, which somehow validate your idea of who God is and what your devotional path might be. I think it's verse 8 of Oladu Nalpadu. Almost everybody who translates this verse, in my mind, misses the essential point that Bhagavan is saying. He's saying, if you have devotion to God, then you can see him in a form that you imagine. So what he's saying is that the mind can have any idea about God and can have an experience of God, which is that idea which you've created of him. You can be absorbed in that idea and you can have a unifying experience of God. But God is not a name, God is not a form. And then in the middle of the verse, he switches direction and says, but the true self isn't a name, it's not a form. So you're not truly experiencing God by reaching out to him and trying to have this experience of a name and a form. So most people look at this verse and they say, and it's a kind of wishful thinking, they think that Bhagavan is saying that through name and form devotion you attain God. But what he's saying is that through name and form devotion you attain him in that name, in that form that you yourself are imagining. But since God ultimately is not a name and form, you're not having an experience of the true God by doing this. It's only when the names and forms vanish that you get to the true nature of the self, the true nature of God, and abide there. And the implication of this for me is that you can occasionally get lost in the devotional practices simply because they do tend to be so apparently rewarding. That they do give you wonderful states, they give you the blisses, they give you the visions, they give you all kinds of boxes to tick. I'm a great devotee, I'm following a great path, all these wonderful things are happening to me, but the me is already there. The me is not ultimately being tackled. The me is somehow expanding as the wonderful experience of all the visions, all the God practices that you're doing somehow come back, and they don't eliminate the I, they just make it, I will say a pure I, but it's not an I that's disappeared in its source, it's an I that has experiences.
So when surrender, I mean that self-inquiry automatically means self-surrender, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
This first quote that I gave, to me, it's Bhagavan saying, if you really want to surrender,
yes,
then you have to isolate the I. Surrender is not your bad habits, your thoughts, your feelings. You're not surrendering. You know, maybe your son has just had a motorbike accident, and instead of saying, I surrender all this to God, God, please look after him, please make him better, please don't make him die. That's most people's idea of a relationship with the divine. What Ramana is saying, that there's somebody in there who wants, chooses and decides, and true surrender is not asking for things to be different than they already are. You're not asking for some kind of divine intervention, or not saying, I leave everything in your power, I leave everything to you, you decide what to do. This is all somehow buying into the idea of an individual self. He's saying that the true surrender is when there is nobody left who wants or chooses or decides, or who thinks this is a better outcome than the other outcome. I'm just telling you about this and I'm leaving it all to you. So that there's a level of still remaining attached to individual identity that goes with most people's idea of what surrender is. Whereas Bhagavan is saying the true surrender is when you isolate the one who wants to surrender, watch his games, watch his practices, watch how he creates realms for himself in which he can enjoy himself, isolate that I, and make that I go back to its source and disappear. And that's the true surrender.
Yes, but it can be done by self-inquiry.
It can be done by self-inquiry, and I'm not dismissing devotional practices. There are many great saints of India who became absorbed in the idea of God, and their sense of individuality was ground away kind of bit by bit until there was nothing left. Manikavachika, one of Bhagavan's favorite Tamil saints, has a lovely verse in which he talked about Shiva grinding him down layer by layer until there was only a layer that was 1 atom thick, and then the 1 atom thick layer went and he became one with Shiva. So that this is a recognized way traditionally, but Bhagavan himself wasn't really endorsing it. He never told people not to do it if that's what they were inclined to do, but he did seem to think that devotional practices could put you in realms of individual enjoyment, which would be just as much a distraction as more material identifications.
Markus had hands up. Would you want to continue?
Yes.
Okay.
David, I mean that generally, as we understand and we know, it is said that surrender and self-inquiry is 2 sides of 1 coin, right? So, but it seems there is a difference anyways. I mean that when you practice self-inquiry, it means that this is the moment when you separate everything from I, and you are constantly always directed only to your source. Mm-hmm. Until everything disappears at all. And but when there is self-surrender, there is a duality still there. So there is you, and you surrender yourself to some.
That there is, and you, how should we say, you practice within this assumption of duality. If you're surrendering, you might think, I am not the doer of my actions. I am not the performer of all the things that the body is doing. Or you might think, I will personally hand over this little problem to God. I'm not going to obsess over it. I accept that my individuality is non-existent. I have this problem right now. I will hand over all thoughts about this problem to the divine and let him look after it. These are all things that Bhagavan accepted and endorsed as good ways of following the devotional path. And he said that their goal was to inculcate a conviction that the divine alone existed and that you had no independent existence separate from it. And he said, but by slowly putting yourself into the state where you could experience that you weren't the doer, and that all actions were somehow determined by God and fulfilled by God, you stopped having any individual will or intention that was separate from that divine. He said that this was a roundabout way of getting back to that point of knowing directly that there is no individual I. But he said it was possible. It was a long roundabout route. But he did concede it was possible to do it that way.
So actually, self-inquiry is the final something.
No.
Final step.
He did say that everyone has to come to the self either through self-inquiry or by unconditional surrender. He said, whichever other path you might be practicing, he said, like tributaries join bigger rivers and bigger rivers join bigger rivers. He said there were only two rivers that discharged into the ocean of enlightenment, and they are self-inquiry and surrender. And my personal feeling is that they merge into one river. That the final exit point is when the self surrenders itself to its source. And that in that final state of the flow, self-inquiry and surrender are identical.
because to me, I still think that self-inquiry is the final step, and the same thing is with I mean that when you reject this existence of everything, and you have to anyway be directed into your source, so you are not going to Manalaya, for example.
Not going to Manalaya. Yeah. Was that a statement or was that a question?
I think rather maybe just subject to discussion.
Okay. I'm not disagreeing. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Was Marcus, you had something before I forget? Did you have a question, please?
Yes. Yes. Hello, David.
Hello.
Could you say something about the relation between dispassion and detachment and surrender, and also about the heading in Kuruvachaka Kovai, which is number 46, awareness is detachment. Thank you.
Can you say what the Guru Vachaka Kovai is? Shall I get a copy out and read it, or?
Well, the heading is awareness is detachment.
Okay.
Should I also read the verse?
Is there a verse that goes with it? What does it say?
It goes like this. Awareness, clear and pure, is nothing but seeing the world as nothing other than the perceiver. Mind enthroned and planted in the heart, deeming this world as a mere seeming, not an object, is detachment.
Okay, so Bhagavan is talking about the state when individual I has dissolved in its source. I think he's equating that state with detachment. He's saying that in that state, world appearance might be there, but it's absent a perceiver of it. It's simply something that's there as an appearance in the self, and that the disappearance of that I constitutes detachment, because there's no longer any involvement in it, because there's no longer an individual I who sees it and feels any need to interact with it. So I think he would say the true detachment is not an act of volition, not an act of choice from an I who declines to get involved with the world. It's that state when the I no longer exists. So there's no longer even the option of getting involved with the world, because there's nothing left to choose or decide whether to see it or get involved with it. I think that's the state he's referring to in that verse.
Okay, so there's a lot of dispassion also when there's high maturity or surrendering.
I don't think he's talking about a stage or a level of practice when he speaks like this. He's saying that there is a state in which I has definitively disappeared, and that's the true state of detachment. In that state, there's nothing or no one left who has to exercise discrimination. He, she is never tempted not to go out and be involved in this world, because that I has effectively vanished. So there's never a possibility of it extroverting again and getting involved in worldly activities.
Okay. I also meant like in general level, but yeah.
You want to elaborate a little?
Like in general level, like to surrender is to have this passion and not get attached.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think Bhagavan said this on multiple occasions, that the first thing you need to do is lose interest in the world. On one occasion, he says, I tell people again and again that the world is unreal, simply because if they accept my words on this, then they get less excited by it, their mind doesn't run out to it, it doesn't feel any need to enmesh itself in things that are not ultimately real. So I tell people again and again that the world is not real, simply to discourage themselves from actively seeking pleasures and enjoyments from it. So he said in the final state, the world is real because it's an unmanifest appearance in your own self. But at the stage of practice, you have to accept that the world is somehow your creation and it's tempting you to move outwards to gratify your desires in this appearance that you've created for yourself. So he's saying that all these things you see in front of you are essentially your own projection. They're not truly real because you've projected separation. You've projected an individual I who wants fulfillment through enjoyment of these phenomena. He said that that's your fundamental misidentification. You take yourself to be a person, and then you see a world in front of you that's got lots of exciting things to take your attention outwards. Then you run after them, and then you forget who you are, you forget what your source is. So Bhagavan is saying dispassion, disinterest, vairagya is an important first step to keep your mind off the things that it wants to run after and instead take it back to its source. It's not going to stay in its source, it's not going to want to be there rather than extroverting until you've taken that firm decision that I am not going to run after things in the external world because all of those things are just going to cause suffering and trouble. So this is, if you like, the fundamental step of dispassion, disinterest, to recognize that all the things of the world are only there to cause distractions, and that there's somebody who registers, experiences them, and that's the place that attention should be put. And you can encourage yourself to go back to that source by constantly having the notion that everything out there fundamentally has no value, so one shouldn't constantly be putting attention on it.
We have Jan and then Shruti questions. Go ahead, Jan.
Yeah, with regard to this, David, could you speak about how actually running after desires causes actually suffering? So it is not good to run after desires, please.
Desires are always for things that are other than yourself, and that's where suffering arises. True happiness is in being your own self, and unhappiness is from imagining that you are something other than what you are, and that things that appear to be different from you are ways of attaining satisfaction, pleasure. Sometimes you run after things and they give you pleasure and you're happy briefly, but there's never any permanence to anything in a fulfilled desire, because the moment it's fulfilled, that particular desire vanishes and is replaced by the next desire. There's never any end to desire, because desire is a symptom of the fundamental notion I am an individual person inside a body who needs to validate himself, herself by associating with objects and attaining gratification from them. So there will always be suffering so long as there is an individual self who has set himself or herself up as an entity in a body who needs to do something or attain something, because the vast majority of desires can never be attained, can never be fulfilled. And so the frustration of not getting all of these desires fulfilled is ultimately what produces the suffering. And this is why all the jnanis say that jnana is the state of absolute desirelessness. In that state, nothing arises to say, I want what I don't have, because everything is your own self. And when you are that self, then you know that there's nothing apart from yourself that you're not already knowing, enjoying, and experiencing. So in that state, the desires for things, desires to fulfill ambitions have vanished, because there's a recognition and a knowledge that there's nothing apart from you to be attained, discovered, enjoyed, nothing that will ever give you any more gratification than you have from being your own self.
Okay, Shruti, please.
Hi, Lucy. Hi, hello, David.
Hello.
I belong to India and I'm born and raised there. So I have heard this since childhood, something called Sam Purush. So Sam means equal, same. So the definition is like this, that when you see yourself in everybody, and when you see everybody in yourself, and some excitement does not make you happy, and some sad thing does not make you sad. So that is what a Sam person is. So David, do you think that this is any different from surrender?
I would say surrender is the process, and the state you're describing is the state attained when surrender is complete. I don't think you can have that perspective or that experience until individual I has vanished. People occasionally ask Bhagavan, how can you tell who's enlightened and who's not? And he had two yardsticks, if you like, to judge. One was the peace that you feel in his presence, and the other was the equality with which he treats all the beings around him. So that fundamental sense of equality comes from a knowledge and experience that you are essentially all of the beings that you see around you. You're not different from them. You know yourself to be all those beings. You accept that oneness. So that's the state that you're talking about. And Bhagavan said that this is, if you like, a key hallmark of the jnani, that they have fundamental equality, an equality of vision, an equality of perspective, in which they treat all beings, all things as their own self. But I don't think it's something that you can practice. It's something that you attain when the individual I finally disappears. But people used to pile food on Bhagavan's plate in the dining room, and he said, why don't you feed everybody else the same amount as me? He said, I eat through 1,000 mouths. So I like this. So when you're a jnani, the person who's sitting at the other end of the dining room eating food is feeding Bhagavan. We tend to localize him. We say he's the person sitting up against the wall, and we pile all the food on his plate. We localize him in that position. He knows that he is every single person in that dining room, and that by putting food on every single person's plate in an equal amount, everybody getting the same amount, that's fundamentally practicing equality. And when everybody in that room picks up a mouthful and puts it in their mouth, that this is Bhagavan himself eating through everybody's mouth in that room. That was Bhagavan's state, that was his knowledge, and that this is what it's like to be one with all the beings in your vicinity. You don't say, I alone should get more food than other people. I'm the jnani, all you people should serve me. He knew that he was every single person in that room, and if every single person in that room got the same treatment that he got, he would be happy, because he was fundamentally an egalitarian who saw the same self in all beings and expected all beings to be treated the same way.
So this can start like treat others the way you want yourself to be treated.
Yeah, you can start out by doing that. You can treat others as you treat yourself. You can practice equality, but you're not going to have that experience until the I disappears. It's nice to be egalitarian in your outlook, but you can't pretend that you're in that state. Practicing that way of life doesn't put you in that state. It just makes you a very nice person, but you're still a person. You haven't got rid of the idea that you're a person. You're just a person who practices equality. You haven't got the fundamental equality that comes from self-abidance.
Thanks, David. I have heard one story in childhood. Like I do not know do not remember the things exactly, but it's something like this, that one person is given, say, $1,000, and that person is asked distribute it like God would do. And that person gave 90% to one person, and remaining 10% he gave 5% he gave to the second person, and 5% he gave to third person, and nothing to the rest of the people. So like the distributions are not done equally when he was asked to distribute like God. Do you want to say anything about this? Like what is your opinion about it?
I hope I can remember this story properly. I think Bhagavan told this story about, I think he said it was from either Yoga Vashishta or it was the sage Vashishta, about a group of people who went to see him to test whether he was treating everybody equally or not. I think there were some Brahmin Pandits, there were some outcasts, that there was a herd of cows involved. Vashishta, he sent the cows to the cowshed, he sent the Brahmin Pandits to the Brahmin quarter, and he sent the outcast to the outcast community. And when somebody said, you're treating all these people differently, he said, I see the same self in all of them, but I'm giving them appropriate treatment, what they're used to. You can't send the cows off to live in the Pandit houses. The cows are used to cowsheds. The Brahmins are used to living in a Brahmin environment. So he said, I may recognize the fundamental sameness, the equality, the self that's in all of these things, but all these things, they have forms, they have characters, they have personalities, and those personalities have been trained to enjoy particular environments. So since then, I guess, I sent them out to enjoy an environment which I thought they would derive the most satisfaction from. I'm not distinguishing because I think one is better than the other. I'm not sending some people to better houses than others. I recognize the self in all of them, but I also recognize that these are people who have a sense of individuality, and that individuality is catered for in different ways in different communities. And I'm just following the rules and regulations of those communities and trying not to offend people by sending them to the wrong place. So the jnani recognizes the self in all the beings that come to him, but he's going to treat them in a different way according to their backgrounds, what they expect, what they need, but it doesn't mean he ever forgets that they're all the self.
Okay.
Thanks, David. Can I ask one last
Of course.
thing? Can I? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, carry on.
David, sometime back you were answering to Marcus when you told about this detachment. Then, so to inquire, sometimes you need to detach from the world, something like that. So I just want. I think about it several times, that when you see that there is a suffering, say there is some natural calamity and many people are suffering, what would Bhagwan do in that case? In that case, you are going out to help, or you would say that, okay, that's how the world goes.
I will answer this empirically rather than philosophically, because sometimes he would discourage people from adopting ways of life which I would call professional do-gooding. He said, don't spend your life trying to improve the world. It's Ishvara's job to look after the world. Your job is to look after yourself. Your job is to become one with Ishvara. Ishvara's job is to look after the world. Don't think that you can do a better job than he does. Leave the running of the world to him. Look to yourself. Look to becoming one with Ishvara, and don't think that you can do a better job of managing the world than he is. So that's one level, which is a little bit abstract. But on a practical level, you could see that Bhagavan wouldn't ever allow anybody to be treated badly in his proximity. So whether that was a tree or a dog or poor people coming to the ashram, but there was a cultural conditioning which caused some people to treat animals badly or treat the trees badly outside the old hall or treat poor people in a way that wasn't egalitarian. And when he saw this happening, he would always get very upset, and he would always tell off the people who were treating people badly or wrongly in his proximity. So that was something that everybody around him knew, that you couldn't get away with discrimination around Bhagavan. He would always take the side of the underdog. If he saw somebody who was being maltreated or wasn't being looked after properly, he would personally intervene and make sure that they got treated the same as everybody else. But then he wouldn't ever extend his range, if you like, beyond his own personal environment. So he wouldn't get very excited about what was going on in Vellore or Madurai or Pondicherry. His instincts to help were very localized. Whatever he came across in his life that he could see was suffering or things happening that shouldn't be happening, he would take a stand, he would interfere, but he would never extend that to a campaign outside his personal orbit, if you like. So I would take that as a good yardstick of what to do in the world. As you move through the world, if you see things that are wrong in front of you, then do something about them to the best of your ability, but don't go home and agonize over things that are going on thousands of miles away that aren't your business. You were brought into this world, according to Bhagavan, to find out who you were, not to make the world a better place. If you see suffering in your vicinity, then do something about it, but don't turn it into a full-time career. Don't be a professional do-gooder and think your mission in the world is to run all over the place and solve problems. You have been put into this world, and if you're interested in Bhagavan, in spiritual life, then you have a rare opportunity to find out who you are, to practice his teachings, to eliminate the idea that you're an individual person. Don't waste that opportunity by dissipating all your energy, all your attention on extraneous things which are not your business, not your concern. Keep your attention on the self, on God, but then don't tolerate inequality or suffering in front of your nose, but don't make a career of trying to solve all the world's problems. I think that was Bhagavan's demonstrated behavior, and I think that's what he taught to the people who came to see him.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shruti. And Leng, please, you have a question.
Yeah. Hi, David.
Hi.
Yeah. I have no not a specific question, and just like when I listen David talk about that reminded me, and when I was reading Robert Adams, and he always say, leave the world alone, keep the distance with the world. And I remember he said, if you want to save the forest and the people cutting the trees, and you feel bad and you want to save the trees, that's fine, go save the trees. But the trees will not appreciate that. You have to understand that. Yeah. So that remind me that. Yeah, and also remind me on David's website, I think there is an article. It's called like you don't practice you don't practice the in the daily life. You don't practice Advaita Vedanta in daily life. At first, I was very confused, and I read the articles many times, and I kind of figured like just David said the example, like Morris asked Bhagavad about why we treat people equal, why we don't treat people equally. Yes, that's exactly it. David just mentioned the story. That's after I read the story, I understand why the title is like why we don't practice Advaita in the daily life. Yeah.
This is another interesting aspect of Bhagavan's teachings. I think this article, it mentioned that story from Vasishta, but I think the main thrust of the article was about verse 39 of Oladu Napadu Anubandham, which basically says that you can practice Advaita towards all the beings in the world, including the gods in the heavens, but don't ever try to practice it towards the jnani. Now, this is a very odd verse. Anamale Swami got a good answer. Maurice Friedman got a good answer. Sadhuam has written a commentary on this. And my understanding of this verse, which Bhagavan picked out, I think Anamale Swami asked Bhagavan to translate this sentiment from a Sanskrit, pre-existing Sanskrit verse, which he made into Tamil, and it's now in Oladu Napadu Anubandham. And the best explanation I have come across is that you never ever should regard yourself as being the equal of the Guru. The Guru is the one person, the one being who has the possibility of getting you out of the ocean of rebirth. Don't presume that you're his equal. Don't think you're the same as him. Don't have this conceptual Advaita towards the Guru. He and I are one. Always treat the Guru with reverence. Always treat him with respect. Always accept that he is your one possibility of attaining liberation in this life. The verse is saying you can show equality to everything else in the world, even to the gods in the heavens above and the underworld, if you want to, but don't ever pretend that you're on the same level as this Guru. That's a lack of respect. And without that respect to the Guru, you're never going to transcend duality. So it's quite an interesting verse in which I think Bhagavan is endorsing the idea in the original Sanskrit verse that you can think or practice some kind of equality towards all the beings in the heavens, all the beings in the world, but don't ever imagine that you're on the same level as or in the same state as the Guru, because that's disrespectful and it somehow disqualifies you from receiving the Guru's grace, which will put you in the state that he himself abides in all the time.
I'd like to know what does it actually mean, really, because how, for example, to treat everybody equally? In what sense then?
I don't think you can until you reach that state. I think this is the problem with this particular idea, because if you imagine that you're a person, then you're imagining that you're an individual self, and then you have to make choices, you have to make decisions. Let's say you've got this $1,000 in your bank account, and you're thinking, oh, all is one, everything is my own self. Some people haven't got $1,000, what shall I do with it? You might, based on your inclinations, give it to a Save the Trees charity, you might be interested in orphans, you might be interested in 50 different things, but your individual self will make a choice to allocate your resources to some part of this world that you see in front of you. You can't equally distribute $1,000 to all the beings, all the animals, all the trees. No, you can't do that. You have to make choices. You have to make decisions. And I think what Bhagavan is saying is don't concern yourself with mass welfare, with putting the world to right. If you want to, you can imagine that you are in the same state as everything else in the world. That's a good attitude to have, but you can't solve the world's problems because every decision you make comes from a sense of individual self. And in that sense, they're selfish. We tend to use the word selfish to mean egotistic, self-interested, but I'm taking it to mean operating from a sense of self. Every decision that comes from the idea that you are an individual self is by definition selfish.
Exactly.
You are choosing and deciding which people to help, which people not to help, because that's how an individual self functions.
Yeah.
You can never have this fundamental sense of being the substratum underlying all beings until that sense of self is gone. And when it does go and you become that substratum, then you do truly become egalitarian. You are, as Bhagavan said in his favorite Gita verse, you are the self in the heart of all beings, and you know it, and you are dispensing your own self, your own grace equally to all the beings in the universe by simply being the heart of all beings. You can't do it from the base of being an individual person, because that involves making selfish choices, selfish decisions based on the idea that you're an individual self. But when that self goes and you become the substratum, then there is true egalitarianism. The substratum that you are is spontaneously radiating out into all of those beings in the world, and they're all benefiting equally from your state of self-abidance. But so long as you think I am a person, then you can only ever be selfish and make selfish decisions.
Yes, I mean that as long as there is you and there is guru, really.
Right.
So I mean that so long this ego still exists. It exists still. I mean that it is
The ego of the devotee, yeah. This again, it's part of the tradition that even if you do become liberated through the power of your guru, even then you go and you prostrate to him, you treat him as a great being.
Of course.
You never, sit next to him on his sofa and say, we are one.
Yes.
There's this nice verse, Siva Prakasam Pillai wrote about it in his verses, and it appears in Guru Vanchadikovai. And Bhagavan saying is that the enlightened disciple is like the wife who publicly treats her husband with respect. In the bedroom, they've attained union, but out in public life, the wife still pretends there's separation, because that's the correct formal show of respect that's expected in the community. But internally, they've attained that union. So he's using that analogy that even though the union has taken place, the devotee has the knowledge of union, of oneness. Still, whenever there's any public event, the disciple will always show veneration, respect, and subservience to the guru.
Definitely, because I think it is very natural state of things. How is it possible? I mean, not to treat with such respect your guru who actually brought this thing. It's impossible, I think. Not to treat.
I think it's natural to treat your guru this way, and to never put yourself on the same level or claim you're in the same state. But the ones who have done that just tend to be rather egotistic. They haven't lost their ego at all.
Yes.
So we can say that, excuse me, that what prevents us from this surrender is, of course, possibly this liking to enjoy the objective world, and the possibility to get satisfaction or enjoyment, fulfilling desires and so forth, is still more stronger than this desire to willing to surrender by investigating or giving attention to the I and where does it come from. So we have a struggle or fight still 60-50 going on, that this liking to go out, it's much stronger still than the liking to go in, if we put it like this. So is that basically what prevents it, our own liking?
That's everybody's problem. Somebody once, this is one of my favorite answers that Bhagavan ever gave. Somebody once asked him, why am I not enlightened here and now? What's preventing me? And his one-line answer was, your wandering mind and your perverted ways. It's all of your habits, all of your thoughts. They're all propelling you in the wrong direction. And that's the energy, the extroverting energy that makes you behave and think the way you do, is what ultimately prevents you from knowing who you are.
Yes. Any more questions about this? There was this little idea also related to this surrender, and that what's the, or is there any part of free will? What's the free will doing here, or is that just the thing preventing, or what?
Well, Bhagavan wrote in Olavinapadu that the question of free will or determination, predetermination, can only ever arise to an individual who might think he has it, one or the other, or that both are in some kind of balance. He said, in the self, there is neither free will nor predetermination, because there's no entity to whom they can adhere, attach, or be considered by. So he said the ultimate answer to that is there is neither free will nor predetermination, because the only entity who might have them has disappeared in the state of self. If you do, though, imagine that you are an individual self, he was, on the whole, quite categorical that your actions are pretty much determined by a script you get given by Ishvara. He got a lot of questions on that. It's very counterintuitive, and he always seemed to dig in his heels and refuse to budge from that. So that there are two, I won't say get out of jail free cards on this, but he did say that the only freedom you have is on a moment-to-moment basis to recognize that you're not the doer of all the scripted actions that the body is performing. This seems to imply a level of free will that I take this to be an incentive to do self-inquiry. So self-inquiry is the process of getting out of the notion that you are the doer. He said by not buying into the idea that you are the doer, that you're the person performing actions, then the power of that doer lessens. And he said that is within your capacity, that is your choice. So he was giving everybody a bit of wiggle room. He said you always have the freedom to turn within. You always have the freedom to be aware of the I that appears to be performing actions and realize that it's not. And then there's a nice little line in spiritual instruction, Upadesha Manjari, where Bhagavan says, destiny only affects the extroverted mind. So if you want to take this as, you could say by extension, the more you introvert the mind, the more you transcend your destiny. Or you could see it as a binary system, that if you have an extroverted mind, then you're in ignorance. And if your mind is gone completely, you're in a state of jnana knowledge, and there's no destiny, no free will. That's one possible interpretation of that. Or you could have it as a more gradual explanation, that the more you take the mind back to its source, the more you begin to transcend your destiny. I think both options are open. And it's an open question with regard to my understanding of Bhagavan's teachings, because in the entire record of everything he ever said, nobody, unfortunately, ever sat him down and said, are thoughts predetermined? So if he was going to say that all thoughts are predetermined, then we really are in trouble. But all he ever said was that actions are predetermined, and we do have the freedom to not identify with the one who's performing the actions. So that there's this gray area that he never really talked about. To what extent is thought predetermined? He always said actions were, but so far as I know, he never was asked that question, never replied to the question as to whether thoughts were predetermined. I think that all gives us the option of looking at the individual I. We have that choice, we have that freedom. And he says, fundamentally, that's the only true freedom we all have.
David, regarding this question, actually, it seems that at least what I learned from Michael James, it is different. Because, first of all, if we, for example, take a question of karma, karma, how karma can accumulate if there is no free will, that actually
There is no what?
Karma, if there is no free will. I mean that if everything is predetermined, including our thoughts, for example, and our actions, and the only freedom we have to do this self-inquiry, so how karma can exist at all? So I mean that what Michael says is that our actions are predetermined, and he very often mentions this message that he wrote to his mother.
Right.
Yes, and which means that actions are predetermined, but our thoughts, at the same time, we can have our desires, our thoughts, our likes, dislikes, which results in karma in next lives.
So Bhagavan, interestingly, generally he would explain things from the Vedantic, Advaitic point of view, but his teachings on karma very closely resembled or are derived from Saiva Siddhanta, which is a much more dualistic system. I find this an interesting part of his teachings. So, for example, the first verse of Upadesha Undiya, Upadesha Saram says, actions bear fruit by the ordinance of God. So when he explained that, he would say that actions by themselves are neutral. There's nothing in actions that causes consequences, but there's this strange entity called Ishvara who has taken a choice, that's the ordinance word, who has chosen to allocate consequences to all actions. He says Ishvara is the person who allocates karma, who in between lives sifts through all your pending karma and allocates what you're going to do in your next life. So in a sense, there's this external deity who checks up on you every life, sees what you've done, sees all the karma, and then decides a script for you for the next life, which is giving you the maximum choice to make spiritual benefit. This is a very cyber idea, but it's one that Bhagavan always adopted when he gave an explanation of karma, that there is this God entity or process that somehow has decided that actions have consequences. They're not inherent in the actions, and that because there are consequences to actions, good and bad, then he's the one who keeps the books, if you like, allocates the karma and decides what you're going to be in your next life, where and what you're going to experience and suffer. But having said that, he also said that Ishvara isn't a fundamentally real entity, that you bring a world into existence by the rising I separates itself into an internal seer, an external world, and a God who looks after that world. He said that this is the process of self-creation, the drishti shrishti thing that he talked about, that you bring into being an external world with other apparent beings in it, and overseeing all the events of that world, you have this thing called God. But he said that's basically your projection, your idea, and that when you do self-inquiry, what disappears is not just the notion of an external world. What disappears is this concept of Ishvara, the God who also looks after it. So he told, I think it was Paul Brunton, he said, Ishvara is the last of the unreal forms to go. So there's this great burst of manifestation at the beginning in which you are created as an internal observer, an external world, that your destiny, the things going on in that world are governed and run by this entity he calls Ishvara. But he said it's all part of your projection, and that when you go back to your source, the notion of externality disappears, the notion that you're a person inside the body disappears, and also ultimately this God figure who chooses and allocates your destiny also disappears, and you, quite literally, you transcend God, you transcend Ishvara by eradicating definitively your own sense of being an individual self.
Okay, David, yes, Ishvara is, you are talking now about Ishvara as someone who decides for us what karma to choose for us in our life, right?
So can you say that? My volume just went out for a bit. Say it again.
Ishvara is someone who chooses for us our destiny, right? But some particular lives. So.
This is what Bhagavan chose to say as an explanation of the process by which it worked, but he also said that Ishvara is fundamentally not real, and that by eliminating your sense of individuality, you also eliminated Ishvara.
Yes, so I was thinking, what about the second chapter of Bhagavad-Gita, where Krishna says that there has been never time that all these kings, you, Arjuna, and I have not been existed, and in the future, never of us, all of us shall not cease to be.
And the question is?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you, yes.
So my question is that, what about the second chapter of Bhagavad-Gita, where Krishna says that, all these kings and you, Arjuna, we will never cease to exist, and in the future we won't cease to exist also.
I think Bhagavan would. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I think Bhagavan would frame this kind of conversation, dialogue, the same way that I explained it a few minutes ago, that if you think that you are in a world, then there will be a God who runs that world. There will be a God who makes godlike decisions for manifestation, who makes proclamations like this. But at some point, when you disappear into your source, then you transcend all notions, all concepts of God.
Okay, thank you.
But David, could I continue? Because I haven't. I just wanted to talk about this. What is it?
It's not us. It's somewhere with David's phone or something. Somehow it's giving this signal, bling bling, constantly. If it's their phone or what, I don't know. It's not here. This sound. Some kind of a information bling bling.
I'm sorry. There's something periodically goes wrong with my sound. It just goes 100, 99, 98 all the way back to 0. And I'm not touching it. It just randomly by itself keeps disappearing back to 0.
Should you go? I mean, go. What do you call it? Go away and come back. Does it help? Is it some kind of reboot thing? I don't know. Of course.
I have never seen this before. It's like the sound is just spontaneously wanting to close itself down.
Whose will is this? Is this a free will or what?
Ishvara.
I've got a temporary solution. I've got my mouse permanently pressed on 100, and it keeps going down to 90 and jumping back to 100. So that might keep it going a bit longer.
Okay, let's try again.
Yes, I just wanted to because we were talking about free will. So I mean that we somehow. Can you hear me now, David?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that according again to Michael, that I mean and actually you also, David, you also wrote about this in your Be As You Are, at least, about 3 types of karma. That is prarabdha, agamya, and sanchita. So I mean that. Prarabdha is okay with prarabdha. What we now have, this is our prarabdha, this is our destiny. It was chosen for us by, let's say, Ishvara, so we now have to go through this now. At the same time, when we are not doing self-inquiry, for example, when our mind is not directed inside and goes out. In this way, next karma creates. So as I'm not wrong, it accumulates in sanchita, right? And I forgot what is the difference between sanchita and agamya. But anyway, I mean that our thoughts, if we are still interested in this world, whatever we are interested in, this creates next karma for us. So I mean that this is how it works. This is the mechanism. So I mean that there is our free will is not limited to only possibility to do self-inquiry. I mean the free will is constantly, it is here. But I mean that it is not will to do something, because what we have to do, it was chosen for us by Ishvara, let's say. But what we are thinking, our desires, our attachments, our likes, dislikes, this creates new karma that we have to. And again, but of course, it doesn't cancel this approach that what, let's say, Ishvara chooses for us to have. Of course, it is for our good.
So the cyber idea of karma is that God isn't a punisher of things we've done badly. He's got our best interests at heart, and that whenever he makes a script for us, he works with the materials we have, our past karma, and he tries to arrange a future life in which the maximum spiritual benefit can be obtained. So he's a kind of parent who's always trying to straighten out the messes of his children and trying to give them a good start again, so they can have a bit better chance next time round. So in that sense, he allocates karma out of love. This is the cyber idea, not out of a sense of punishment or even neutrality. So he's on your side. He's trying to arrange things that will make you live your life in a productive spiritual way. But at the same time, he doesn't cancel anything. Everything you've done creates karma, and all that karma is carried forward. And the only way out of it is to extinguish the one who thinks he has the karma, at which point all karma ceases.
According to what Michael says, if something, not our actions create karma, but our intentions. I mean, what is in our mind?
I think that's a Buddhist idea as well. Choosing to do something and the motives that you choose creates the karma. Actions in a way don't create karma. It's why you're doing something. I am doing this out of greed. I am doing this out of envy, and it's those motivations that are creating the karma. As Bhagavan himself said, actions themselves are inert. They have no moral consequences. It's simply that we've somehow been introduced into a game in which God controls the destinies, the scripts, and the only way out of the game is to stop pretending you're a character in the game.
Yes, it is. It is about the same. It's the same thing as what Bhagavan said in his note to his mother, that
Right.
whatever happens with you, it has to happen. But the thoughts that you have, this is because otherwise karma cannot exist without our free will. Otherwise, how?
I think this note that Bhagavan wrote to his mother was just, I won't say it was a philosophical justification for saying, don't expect me to come home. His mother wanted him to come back to his family, and he was basically saying, that's not my destiny. The things that are destined to happen are going to happen, and that doesn't happen to be in the destiny. Don't expect me to come back and live in your house in Madurai. I don't think you can expand that, although it's the earliest known teaching that Bhagavan ever wrote down.
Yes.
And it's quite consistent with his other teachings on destiny and free will. I wouldn't overload it with too much philosophy. I think there's also a personal component. He was simply telling his mother that he could see his future, if you like. He knew what his destiny was, and his destiny wasn't to go home and live with his family again.
Well, maybe it was just some opportunity to him. I mean, that he somehow, whatever Bhagavan says, we can take as teachings, because it seems that he never talks about anything except his teaching.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean that if he puts it so explicitly, I mean that.
I think it's very interesting that at an era when he probably read virtually no philosophy, he only had the direct experience, that even then, as a teenager who'd spent most of his time post-realization in states of samadhi, he knew and understood that individual selves didn't exist, and they didn't have the freedom to choose their lives. He somehow knew that and understood that even as a teenager. I think this is quite significant, that this was a deep insight that he reached, understood, and experienced even while he was sitting in samadhi as a teenager in Tiruvannamalai. He knew the truth about himself, and he also knew the truth about other people who imagine themselves to be individuals, and he knew that individuality didn't fundamentally exist, but that if you did imagine that it had some reality, then you were bound by karma and had to behave in a particular way. I think this is an astonishing insight for an 18-year-old to have, and he brought it out in that one statement he wrote to his mother. I think you can take it to be a fundamental expression that we all have destined lives, and the actions that we do and experience are fixed, But later on, he did qualify this by saying that we have a freedom to transcend our destiny by not identifying with the person, with the body who's undertaking the actions.
Of course, yes.
Jan, did you have something previously on? Any question?
Yeah, I've been thinking about also this for a while, that only freedom we have is to turn inward. We don't have any freedom in regards to what the body do and like future. I was going to say, and it's like, see, I'm thinking then, okay, who is wondering about this? Like, for whom does this question concern? And it's again goes back to ego. It seems like it's very, difficult thing for ego to accept that, there's no freedom at all. It's like terrible thing for ego to know. So yeah, just a comment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, ego can't solve its problems except by extinguishing itself, and that's the last thing it wants to do.
Yes.
But the thing is that they talk about millions lives. They talk about constant lives. That if it would be nice if everything finishes as soon as you turn your mind for a couple of seconds inside, and that's it. No, but then you have just normal life, and you still like something or dislike something or fear or want something and so on. And this is what, as I understand, and at least that Mike also says that, I don't know, somehow I share this idea, that this is what creates karma. This is our free will to want and not want and fear and so on. So it just Michael says, I just share this idea, that's it.
Well, it seems to come to the point that as long as we think we are individuals, we seem to have fate and free will and all of these other things. But when we turn our attention inward and search the where the I comes from or rises, what's the what do you call it, the home or whatever we call it, root, then these things don't mean that much anymore. If there's nobody who's there, if there's no individual to experience anything, then that solves the whole case. And so this free will question, I think it's quite typical and common among spiritual discussions, that can I do what I want or not? And that's only the problem of this individual who we think we still are. And we're so concerned, do we have free will or not? But actually, that just somehow I feel that it shows that there's lacking of interest to stay or turn inward to find out who am I, who thinks to have a free will or not in the first place, rather than just letting it continue.
But at the same time, it is very interesting subject, because this subject explains why it constantly lasts, why it continues. This is,
I think, because there's still this wood left to burn, so to speak.
and it constantly grows.
In Bhagavan's teachings, it's the vasanas which are the driving force of creation, of illusion. So at the beginning of Ashtakam, verse 6, he explains the process of creation as the light of the self falling on all your old vasanas, as light goes through film and then creates a picture on a screen. He says that the pure light of the self acts on your pending desires and somehow expands them into a whole world, which then separates itself into an internal observer, an external world, and a God who looks after all the beings in that world. So it's this vasana, this pending vasana, which is not just the cause, it's the material and the efficient cause. It is what you see in the world is simply an amplification, an expansion of all your desires, of all your vasanas. So when those vasanas go, then the possibility of creation, of projection goes along with it. Mm-hmm. That's why the jnani is desireless. He has no capacity to have rebirth. He doesn't see a world in front of himself. It's desire that creates the world in front of you. It's desire that creates rebirth. And it's the power of the self acting on pending vasanas that brings the world into existence, that causes it to roll along. And at some point when your body dies, the vasanas don't die. They go into hibernation. And then later they spring out again and create a new world for you to enjoy and to suffer in. And it's all a play of your desires. And those desires are going to continue so long as you have the idea of an individual self who wants things that are separate from that self.
And this desire is free will. Otherwise, I mean, it's our desire.
Right. I won't say it's my own insight. I just see it in the same way that video games are created. There's a power that comes up from a plug in the wall with a switch. There's a power that goes into a machine, and there's a program in there that expands into a world. There's the player in the world who has to interact with all these things inside the game. And inherent in this program, there's a controller, someone who says, well done, you finished that level, you can move on to the next level. This is just a kind of computery way of demonstrating how this power in this program expands to make a whole world in which there are levels, there are performers, there are obstacles, there are desires. But when you pull the plug from the wall, there's nothing left. The whole world collapses. When the whole world collapses through the switch on the wall, there is no controller in the game, there is no world, there is no individual, nothing happens anymore. That's what Bhagavan said is the truth of the self. It's ajata, it's no creation. When you pull the plug from the wall, you understand that there never was a game, that the world never did come into existence, there never was struggle, there never were individuals fulfilling desires, striving for liberation, attaining it. He says that this is the final truth, but it's your notion of limitation, your inability to separate yourself from your desires that causes you to buy into the game, and it allows you to continue suffering endlessly until you transcend the game by eliminating the person who dreams all these dreams.
And actually, it seems that we play this game every day. In this, when we are in deep sleep, there is
Exactly.
nothing. Yes, I
Right.
mean, not nothing.
No.
We are as we are. But I mean that, and every day this is level, and every life is level, and every day, it's constantly this new level.
Interesting video game.
Yeah.
Great. So, any questions related to this, or it's been now over 2 hours? How do we feel?
Yeah, I'll just add something from Papaji. I remembered that he said that all this manifestation comes from this single instant. Then in this instant, we think of future, and in this instant, we think of past. And it's only in this instant that gives life to all this manifestation, and our desires like create all these things. Basically, it was just said.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because the thing is that we are already in ours. We are already as we are. It just
Yeah, but may not know it, may not be an experience.
Of course, but I mean that we always have this choice to stop everything.
Not yet.
I think what's unique about Bhagavan is that he's always showing you the exit door.
Yes, yes.
He's saying that this is how suffering occurs, this is how manifestation occurs, this is why you have all these problems, and this is how ultimately you get rid of them. And he's pointing very directly at a very important notion that all of your ideas about God, all of your ideas about free will karma are all contingent and dependent on the idea that you are an individual person who occupies a body.
Yes.
He says, look at that, it's just an idea, it's not real. It's your fundamental reluctance to abandon that idea, to buy into it, that causes your suffering, that makes you think, is there free will? Is there predetermination? I want to strive for this thing called liberation. He said, these are all ideas that are outgrowths of this idea. I live in a body, I'm located in a particular place, I have a mind, I have choices, I must decide what to do. He said, central to all of these is your notion of selfhood, of being an individual. And if you look at that and make that notion vanish, then the whole game collapses. There is no God, there is no world, there is no karma, there is no free will. It all collapses. He said it's like a pile of gunpowder that just goes poof in one big explosion. It doesn't disappear gradually, it just goes, and that's the end of it, and it never comes back.
Exactly. Yes.
But somehow it takes time, because anyway the scriptures they say that it is a matter of getting tired, actually, also.
Yeah.
Matter of getting tired.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know.
if is there any questions related to this or some ideas?
David, may I ask you a personal question about teachers you've been with and just the way, I mean, you met so many sages, but you never seem to commit to stay with one for a long time. I don't know, you probably didn't feel like, I guess.
Well, quite a few of them died on me. That wasn't my choice. Nisargadatta died, Papaji died, and I didn't run away. My central, how shall we say, the teacher for me has always been Bhagavan. From in my early 20s, I've never wavered in that. I've been and sat with other people who had the same effect on me that I read about in the books of people talking about what it was like to be with Bhagavan. I recognize them to be in the same state. I absorbed their presence, I absorbed their teachings, but fundamentally my bond has always been with Bhagavan, and I haven't run around from him from the moment I discovered him when I was about 20 years old. That was it for me, and I've never been anywhere else.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, what to say? We thank David. Thank you once again, and thank everybody who was participating today. It was quite nice amount of people with us, and of course I'll do some editing, and this will be published later on. And hello Timo, also with this Santa Claus kind of beard already. Going on, great. And nice to meet you, Lang, also. Great. Our Chinese translator, David.
Yeah, I recognize this.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
And yes, and everybody else, Truthi and Stacy also. And so until we meet again, I guess, in that case, and let's see what's next and when. And later on in the spring, there's interesting guests coming up. I'll talk about that later and send invites. Thank you very much, David, again.
David, thank you very much.
And
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Yeah.
Thank you, and wish you all the best in Perth, Australia, and you can go anywhere, so enjoy. We're trying to get somewhere.
Australia, very nice place.
Yeah, it's a good place to be. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, and see you next time. And have a very nice evening, everybody, or morning.
Thank you, David. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.